about lending. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, you referenced the speed, whatever, what is that?
Oh, sure. So a CDFI is a community development financial institution. We're a federally certified lender, but we're a nonprofit loan fund. So basically, there are a lot of different CDFIs out in communities across the country. There's over 40 in the state of Minnesota, but Propel is unique in that we only lend to other 501c3 nonprofits. So that's sort of our specialty. We do everything from like building acquisition and rehab, construction projects to short-term lines of credit for working capital. If you are in the market for a loan and you would like to talk to someone, feel free to reach out for me. Feel free to reach out to me after this because it's what I do every day. Okay, let's chat a little bit about business models. And I will just say, if there are questions along the way, if you can come kind of like closer to the owl so I can hear you. But feel free to interrupt me or use the chat function if that's available to you as well. I know we have some folks that are also virtual today. Hello to you as well. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to sort of interrupt. So. Okay, let's chat about business models. So it seems these days that everybody wants financial stability and financial sustainability, right? One of the things that I think that boards in particular think that if we like reach this point of sustainability, we'll have all the financial resources we need, we'll have capacity, and it's going to be permanent, right? It's going to be like once we get to that point, we are good to go. We just need to ride that sustainability wave. But it's a myth, right? Because the only constant that we have in our organizations and in our communities is change. We never really get to that perfect point. It's not something that actually ever happens. And we're competing with, having to make predictions essentially every year when we're creating our budget about how much income we'll receive, what kind of well, especially around income, right? We know that's the hardest part of budgeting is budgeting our income. But, we are in this environment of constant change. So knowing that change is going to be sort of the constant and there isn't one perfect place that we get to. What we really need is good strategy. And we need to be adaptable. We need to kind of be able to roll with the punches, which is something that nonprofit leaders are incredibly good at. But I think part of being able to be flexible and to respond to changes in the environment is really having a great understanding of our business model. So instead of just thinking about sustainability as like the perfect point that we get to, right? We have to kind of think about it in this like comprehensive way. So we have to think about our business model. So how we raise money, how we earn money, and how we spend it. We have to think about how we can be adaptable. And we also have to think about our impact because that is always something that is changing. If we have a business model that works, if we're able to be adaptable as changes arise, and if we are still meeting the impact that we need to, living out our mission in community, then we have reached kind of like a sustainability, a place of sustainability where we can keep that wheel moving time through time. So when we talk about sustainability being comprehensive, we talk about the system a nonprofit creates and utilizes to bring in resources and use them effectively to deliver value, achieve mission, and to have the capacity to endure. So that's what we really want to build is sustainability in the sense that we will always be around if we're needed, right? There are some nonprofits that live out their mission and then they move on, they go away, but there is an argument for being able to grow and change and adapt to what the community needs so that we can continue to move on. So why are our business models changing. First of all, what's a business model, right? It is essentially at the very base understanding, it is the way that nonprofits raise funds or raise resources, whether that is through earned income or through contributed income, and how they use those resources to deliver value, to deliver program, to be out in community. So I think that we've seen, especially in the past 3.5 years, that business models change for a variety of reasons that are sometimes in our control and sometimes completely out of our control. We can't always control the nature of global pandemics. We can't always control the nature of like the interest rate environment or the supply chains, but there are other things that we can kind of move the levers on when those uncontrollable things change. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about over the next few minutes together. So this is essentially, we used to have a really cool slide where the gears would actually move. Envision it, right? Dream about that. The gears are moving together like an old clock. But this is a great diagram of a nonprofit business model. So there are several different elements that make up our one business model. That includes the revenue mix, so what kind of income we have in our organization. It also includes the cost of our program, so how much it costs to do the work that we do. It also includes infrastructure. That could be physical infrastructure that you need to carry out your work. It could be, staff infrastructure or technological infrastructure. And then the last sort of piece of the pie is our capital structure. So this is the money and other sort of fixed resources you have. If you have a building, if you have a fleet of vehicles, if you have a large endowment, that is something that can affect your business model. So we're going to talk through each of these 4 areas of business model during the rest of our time together, essentially. And so again, I'll welcome, if you have questions, feel free to kind of stop me, raise your hand, use your voice, use the chat, whatever works best for you today. Okay, so revenue mix is something that we are, I think, constantly talking about as leaders of nonprofits. Most nonprofits have 2 to 3 sort of dominant types of revenue based on what sort of programming they do, and kind of how their organization is set up. So we often see folks with, let's say they have like government grants and some earned revenue. You might, if you're, for example, a mental health provider, you may have some state funding or county or federal funding, and then you may have some insurance funding, right? So if you are a nonprofit that primarily it works off of donations, you might have 100% of contributed income. You may have grants from corporations or foundations, and then maybe from individuals. So every organization's revenue mix is different, and there isn't one sort of perfect revenue mix. The only perfect revenue mix is one that is, ongoing, right? Something that's very reliable. So a very common source of income for nonprofits is government grants and contracts. We know that grants are sort of a misnomer when we're talking about government funding. We often have to do the work, and then we are reimbursed for the cost of that work or some of the cost of that work. The thing about having government funding sort of in your revenue mix is that historically, that type of funding has been quite reliable. You can count on it year after year. But if you have never had government funding before, there can be a high level of uncertainty in how to like kind of get into that mix. So if you're looking to get into the government funding sort of game, that can be kind of difficult. One of the things that we have to do when we have government funding is to make sure that we're constantly sort of monitoring policy and political changes, because as the environment, as the external environment changes, it can affect the way that we can get funding. So if you have, let's say a governor who's really into education and you have an education related nonprofit, it might be easier for you to get funding during that period of time than for a governor who is maybe less interested in funding different educational programs. So that's just for example. Um, it also takes a long lead time, right, to get initial funding. So there's often lobbying involved, or at least working at the Capitol, working to get money, especially if you're going for like a state appropriation, which is kind of a whole different game. But there is a long lead time for funding. It's not something that just happens overnight, even after you've agreed upon funding. Sometimes it takes months to get a contract and a few months after that to get payment. So it's not something that is quick. If you're looking to get some quick money in the door, government funding is probably not your what you're looking for. There's also a lot of compliance related requirements with government funding, whether that is through, having an audit, having different reporting requirements, making sure that you're spending money precisely as the contract outlines and then reporting on it precisely as the government wants. It can be sometimes tricky to get the reimbursement that you're looking for. We work with a lot of nonprofits that maybe have some challenges in their first few times with a government contract, really getting the reimbursements they want, because it's hard to produce and present exactly what the government entity is looking for. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. And this is where having alliances or, sort of a variety of representation on the board can be helpful, because there may be an individual involved with the agency that's funding your work on your board or something like that. Always keeping those community ties is important for any type of funding, but especially around government grants. Another common type of funding that we see is individual donors or memberships. So these donors can take maybe a while to develop, especially if you're looking for kind of like a big individual donor, but they can be highly reliable. Once people start giving that annual gift, they tend to give it year after year after year. This type of support really comes to us through our reputation, our storytelling, our communications, our ability to reach folks that may want to donate money. Whereas like the government funding is like very sort of regulated. It's you have to fill out application, you have to follow all these rules. The individual donor is a little bit more touchy-feely, right? You have to get out and tell your story, and there are different ways to kind of encourage those donors versus if you're looking at government funding. Often we invite people to be on our boards of directors because of their strong connections or relationships in community, their ability to bring in new individual donors into our fold. And then we also need to think about different sort of systems that we might need for an individual donor program, right? We might need databases or donor software to keep track of all the people that are giving money to our organization and when they give, and maybe some personal information about them. We might also need to be kind of always adjusting our marketing approach to reach new donors. Maybe, in the past, letters were a great way to reach people. Maybe we need to put something in the newspaper or develop some sort of social media outreach. So there are different sort of skill sets and resources that are needed to have a really successful individual donorship program. The next sort of slice of revenue that we often see in organizations, or in some organizations, are earned revenue. So program services. This means that your organization delivers some sort of service or program and you earn revenue as a result. So this can be a reliable source of income as long as the market is happy with your services and is satisfied. If you are thinking about adding some sort of earned revenue source into your mix of revenue that you've never done before, it's also sometimes tricky to or not necessarily tricky, but it is something that where you need to take the time to develop a product or service, to make sure you're responding to needs in community, to really understanding what the market looks like and if you would fit in there with that, what you're offering. We have to understand our competition in community, right? This is much more, this sort of fund raising is much more market driven, right? We have to understand the costs associated with delivering our services and programs. We have customers, we have to keep them happy. But again, it can be a pretty reliable source of income if if that's working well in your community and in your organization. The next and final piece that I'm going to mention today is grant revenue. So we talked about government grants and contracts. We talked about individual donations. We talked about earned revenue. Grant revenue is often, I think, the thing that people think about when they think about nonprofit fundraising, right? We're writing grants, getting money in the door, getting big chunks of money in the door. This, however, as I think have all, if you work in a nonprofit, if you've worked in a nonprofit for any amount of time, you know that the grant environment can be a bit volatile. You may have very reliable funding for a long period of time through a funder, and then they may change their priorities and that funding may go away. So the focus and priorities of funders is always changing and adjusting, just as you're always changing and adjusting your business model to respond to the community. So when we rely upon grant income, we kind of always have to be searching for new sources of income and looking for donors that align with the work that we're doing, the communities that we're living in, and constantly being, developing new relationships, writing new proposals. The skill set for grant writing is not always the same as the skill set for individual fundraising or for writing, government grant proposals. So if you are looking to, bring more grant revenue into your organization, you may need a special, someone with specialized skills to work on that for you. So one of the things that I often hear from boards is, well, we just need to diversify our funding. And that can be important. I think something to think about from a risk standpoint with income is that if we have all of our income in one basket, if we have, only one funder or one stream of income, that can be kind of risky, because if there is some sort of disturbance associated with that source of income, it could be really volatile to our business, right? Back in, I think, 2008, I was the executive director of a very small nonprofit, and we received about 65% of our funding from one single donor. And the ownership of the company of that donor changed, and that donation went away. And as a result, within a year or two, we ended up shutting down that nonprofit because it was simply not sustainable to count on that big source of funding from one organization. And as at that time, obviously it was 2008, middle of financial crisis time, everyone sort of pulling back their donations. It was sort of a perfect storm at that moment. But we had relied on such a big chunk of our funding coming from this one single donor that when they left, we weren't able to replace it. So it's something to kind of think about. When we think about diversifying our income, it's also a way of mitigating risk in our organization. So you don't always have to run out and start a social enterprise or get into government contracts when you've never been there before, if that doesn't really align with your mission and with your work. But if you are looking to kind of mitigate risk, if you do have a big source of income, like one single source of income, and you're looking to maybe get into more diverse funding, these are some of the things that you might need to think about. So different types of income require different things. And we've kind of talked about that here as we've walked through the different types of income. But we need to think about the systems we need to bring in income, whether that's staff members with a specialized skill, whether that's maybe software databases, other accounting structures, especially if you're getting into government funding. You may need some more sophisticated financial reporting than you have right now, depending on what what type of work you're doing. Um, we also need to think about our program management approaches. If we, depending on what type of funding we're going after, maybe that's in service of developing a new program or expanding some of the programming we already have. And so that's just something we need to think about as we, it's not just bringing a bunch of income into the door, right? There are all these other sort of changes that may cascade from that. And we also always need to kind of be thinking about our relationships with community and with funders, because there can always be new opportunities out there, but we have to really kind of foster and dedicate time to building those relationships in order for us to be able to get that funding at some point, right? So, what is something that we can do to kind of better understand the revenue part of our business model? One of the things I love to do, and something we always do in our financial leadership cohort, is to look at our financials kind of from a trend standpoint. And so this is, I think, it's really fun. When I have a stressful day, I like to create a financial trend analysis. Go figure, right? Um, I invite you to do the same. But if you are curious about like what your revenue mix really is, you might have like a gut feeling about what it is, but if you don't really totally understand it, it's cool to build a spreadsheet that will show you this. So you can look at your financial reports, your audits, your 990s. Actually, you probably not 990s because it doesn't break out in great enough detail. But if you can look at your internal financial reports or audits, if you have it, and see where your revenue is coming each year. So, for example, this organization, this is just an example here, has revenue in the form of our support. So they've got individual donations, grants, they've got some government grants, and you can see that when we look at it year over year over year over year, we can start to see some trends. For example, grants are about always 40 to 50% of this organization's income. So that's a huge portion of their revenue every year is coming from grants. That's a good thing to know, right? After grants, we have about 20% of support coming from government agencies. Those are those reimbursing government grants. And then we have about another 20% coming from program service fees. So they're doing some sort of program that earns revenue out in community. So that's really helpful to understand. About 40% comes from grants. So we probably have some staff member or someone dedicated to writing grants and prospecting grants. We probably have someone who is kind of an expert in those government reimbursing grants. And then we probably have some sort of program delivery team that is out delivering programs in community so we can earn that revenue. So just by looking at this trend, we begin to kind of understand things about this hypothetical organization and maybe help us come up with some questions that we might need to ask. So there is a question which I think was just offered. Is there a standard or benchmark of what this should or could be for nonprofits? So I'm going to assume, Scott, that you're asking about revenue mix. Is there sort of a best revenue mix for nonprofits? And the answer is no. There is no one size fits all answer to this. It really depends on what kind of work you're doing, right? There are some areas of work that really are 100% driven by earned revenue. You're out in community delivering program, maybe you're a health provider or a mental health provider. There are different lines of work that align with one type of revenue more than another. There are also plenty of organizations that really get all of their 100% of their revenue from support, so contributed support. There is no answer. It's really just kind of taking time to look at what is the makeup in your organization and to like ask the questions about, is it working for us or is it not? Which is a great entree into the next slide, because this asks the question, if I can get my pointer back here. What if we need to change our revenue mix? What if this is something that like we evaluate where we are and we feel like it's not working, or we need something more to supplement where we're at? So we often try to, just increase the number of grant applications we're making, start a new type of income that someone else had success with. Let's start a coffee shop. Someone else did that. That's a great idea. Or we ask the board to raise funds. These are kind of things we, fall back on. But I think it's also important for us to think strategically about changing our revenue mix. So instead of maybe just like increasing the number of grant applications we're writing, let's really understand our expertise. What is the thing that we are the best at doing, and how could we maximize existing, revenue opportunities from that? What is the thing that you're the best at, and how can you do more of that? Work harder and work smarter, not harder, right? It's also important for us to understand the capacity needed before we're testing new types of revenue. So just because another nonprofit started a coffee shop and was very successful does not mean that you're going to be successful in starting a coffee shop. Starting a restaurant type business is quite an undertaking. And so unless you have the special knowledge and skill around that, it might just lose you money, right? You have to be really strategic about engaging in, new revenue types. And then it's also important for us to always be watching the horizon for pending changes. I think that we often start to hear whispers of, oh, this funder is changing their focus next year, and maybe they'll be kind enough to tell you that they're working on changing their focus. But there are a lot of things that it's important for us to just kind of like pay attention to, keep an eye on in community from a funding standpoint. So that's what I'm going to say about revenue mix. Any questions about revenue or revenue mix? Or have any of you successfully opened a coffee shop? I don't mean to hate on coffee shops. It's just a great example.
Sarah, I think we had one in the chat that came before. They had to do a benchmarking, I believe.
Oh yeah, that's what the question was, is there a standard or benchmark for like revenue mix? And that's what I was kind of talking about. There really isn't like an industry standard. It is really, it's up to you to kind of understand your revenue mix and see if that is working. Is the revenue mix that you have too risky, really? Is it something that you really need to think about diversifying? Is earned revenue, having a high percentage of earned revenue very typical in your line of work? If it is, great. And if if you're successful with that, excellent. There's no need to try and like go after big grants if you are earning the revenue you need through your programming. So it's really just kind of taking time to understand the mix of your revenue, the work that you're doing, and if it feels right, And then if changes are needed, or if you feel like you need to do changes, really thinking about changing the revenue mix in a strategic way versus just like trying new things or throwing a few more grant applications out there.
Sarah, I have a question about as you're exploring, new business models, the danger of mission creep, and when do you decide, hey, we need to make a separate entity or a subset of our organization that is kind of outside of our main organization?
That's a great question. And I think that if you are having those, I think maybe what's not written here, right, is that everything we do is really based in our mission and our values, right? And so as we, or at least, in our work, what we often do is, if we have a new opportunity, we think about, okay, does this help us meet our mission goals? Does it help us meet our goals in our strategic plan? Do we have enough staff capacity to do the things that this funding source would require? You know, always asking those really tough questions. I think that we're always sort of trained to be like, oh, money. We have to get as much money as we can, right? It's so scarce. And it's always important to like come back to, is this in our mission? And I think when we have those opportunities that are smart, that we're ready for, that we, you know, we've engaged in the research and we know that there's a need in community for it, if there's an argument for expanding your mission, or like you mentioned, maybe it's creating an LLC or a different type of organization. But really, I think just having those conversations, I think we often sometimes skip over that part because we need to make the budget work. We need, you know, we need more money. Everyone needs more money. But it always comes back to, and is that in service of our mission? Are we achieving our own goals in saying yes to that new revenue source? I also won't get into like other business income and the tax implications of that, but that's for a CPA to talk about. I'm not a CPA. Okay, let's talk a little bit about infrastructure. So when we think about infrastructure, we're talking about sort of operational infrastructure that helps us meet our compliance requirements. We're talking about, oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself. We're talking about capacity building infrastructure that helps us be more effective in our work. And then the last piece of infrastructure we like to talk about is strategic infrastructure, which really helps us get into the innovative space. And so let's talk about infrastructure for a little bit. So if you remember the vision of like the different cogs that we're blending together in the business model. So we talked about revenue source, which is a big piece of our business model. The next piece we're going to talk about here is the infrastructure. So in addition to money, we also need to have infrastructure in place to do our work and to be successful. So nonprofits are really great usually at operational infrastructure because we're great at compliance. We're good at following the rules. We're good at filing the reports we need to. We often have enough capacity to have good operational infrastructure in our organization. So this includes having employment policies and systems, a solid accounting function, reliable financial reporting. We may have a good database and other ways to track donors or other activities. We have some fundraising capacity, whatever type of fundraising we're doing. We have some staffing around that, as well as maybe some, you know, the database and accounting and reporting, all of those things we need to be successful at fundraising. We have some volunteer recruiting and management in place, as well as some good IT services. So we have reliable computers. We have, again, those the databases and other systems we need. And we're able to recruit board members, to train board members, to bring enough leaders into our organization to help things run smoothly. The next level of infrastructure is capacity building. And this is kind of a level up from that. It helps us become more effective organizations. And sometimes when we really have our bases covered on the operational infrastructure, it's more difficult for us to feel like we fully have infrastructure in place around capacity building. So when we talk about this sort of capacity building infrastructure, this means that we have staff training and development. We have program development. We're taking time to think about what could be, how we want to change our programs, how we want to optimize our programs, what's happening in community. This feeds into our evaluation process and reporting. Do we have an evaluation process? Do we know how effective our programs are? Are we meeting our goals? Do we have time to ask those questions? If you don't, you might need to put a little bit more energy into capacity building. We have a little, on top of just like the baseline support for fundraising, we have fundraising plans and pilots. We're trying new things. We have community outreach, we have communication strategies, board development, strategic planning, partner development. So all of these kind of things that help us build our build our capacity to get to the next level, to kind of build our management muscle, if you will. The third level of infrastructure is strategic. And I feel like this is where, at least in my career, I have been so busy getting the day-to-day stuff, trying to get the capacity built to kind of optimize where we're at, that it's hard to spend a lot of time building strategic infrastructure because there's just not enough time, and sometimes there's not enough money either, right? And so this is kind of the area or the land of innovation. When you have strategic infrastructure, you have time for research and development, thinking about what's next, actually getting into it, doing the research, seeing if what we're thinking about is feasible in community. It helps us, gives us time to think about program redesign and restructuring. We can take time to think about our business model and if it's working or not, can we change it? We're maybe doing some more collaboration in a community. We're thinking about how we can change the organization or how we can replicate and scale some of our activities. So this is a place of, kind of abundance, right? Like we have time, we have money, we have space to think about innovation. So often when we are thinking about infrastructure as an organization, we're trying to keep our administrative costs as low as possible. If we want to try something new, we're like just adding on to the responsibilities of current staff. Sometimes we're trying to get by on old systems or like make an old system do something that we really need a different system to do. And instead of implementing major strategies, we are doing it in small little increments to contain costs. But I think we could also consider, doing a full assessment of our current systems. How might a big organizational restructure help us meet these goals that we have? What would it look like to create long-term projections, financial projections, strategic plans to, support the expansion and the getting the infrastructure to the place where we want it? And then finally, investing in our infrastructure to support revenue and programs, right? Instead of making those small incremental changes that really aren't making a dent in the business model change we want to see, making that bold choice. So I know a lot of these things are hard, but sometimes it's, we need to think about the really big picture when we're trying to make business model change. Any questions about infrastructure? Okay, let's talk about cost of programs. So one of the resources I will share after we're done here today is, so Propel has some resources about business model, about things, and particularly we have a budget tool that really helps you understand the true cost of programs. So one of the pieces of having a really well-functioning business model is to really understand the true cost of our programs. So the example is that you have a county contract that pays $200 for 1 day of client service, but how much does it really cost your organization to provide that service? Is it $200? Is it $180? Is it $240? We don't know. Maybe you do know, and that's great, kudos, but sometimes it takes a higher level of analysis to really understand how much it really costs to deliver our programs. So how do we do that? We look at our budget from a more holistic standpoint. So we can break our budget down into our different programs, which is something we often do, right? Program A, Program B. And then we also have our general and administrative costs. And to really understand the true cost of our programs, what we want to do is spread out the cost of the general and administrative sort of part of our functional expenses as well as the fundraising, and spread that across both the programs so that we really understand how much those programs cost. So you can see kind of in this budget example here, the general and administrative column budget here is about $15,000. And so we spread that $15,000 over the two programs, and we come up with the real cost of these programs. Program A ends up having a bit of a deficit. Program B ends up having a bit of a surplus. But when we do that, we really understand how much it costs to operate our programs. This is helpful in asking for contract increases, for really understanding the cost if we have fees for service, of maybe pricing our products a little bit differently. Really understanding the true cost of your programs is super helpful, and we have a bunch of resources on that, and I will share that. That's one thing I promise I'll share back with you all. Sorry, I got a little tickle in my throat all of a sudden. So when we think about financial stability or sustainability, we really want to understand, and this is the part of understanding our true cost of programs, is to understand kind of the financial stability of a program. So obviously, are our programs losing money? Are they or do we have a net surplus on our programs? The thing about nonprofits, though, is that we don't want to just understand the financial results of our programs. We also want to take some time to think about that mission piece. Are these programs really meeting mission? So in addition to looking at our programs from like a merely surplus deficit standpoint, we want to take a look at and see if our programs are really meeting our mission. Are they a high mission achieving program, or are they not? A tool that we often use, and we were just doing, we just did a presentation of our budget in this sort of format, is looking at in what we call a mission money matrix. And there's a whole book written about this. It's called The Sustainability Mindset. It's by two folks that are nonprofit consultants, and it's a great book. I'll share a link to it if you're interested. But if you're interested in kind of evaluating your budget in a new way, it's really interesting to look at it in this way. So program A has high mission impact, but it's losing money, right? It's low on the financial sustainability scale. Whereas program B has high mission impact and high financial sustainability. This is great. These are the types of programs we want. But we also often have a program that is maybe not super high on the mission scale, but it really helps us meet our financial goals, like a gala. We need these sometimes, right? To help us sustain all this other stuff. But in analyzing our budget in this way, sometimes we also find that we have programs that are low on their financial sustainability and low-ish mission impact. And so if we're looking for big, bold changes to make, or, maybe something to take away or something to change, program D might be something we want to look at, because it's not making money and it's not really helping us meet our mission. And so this can be a tough conversation for organizations, but it can also be a really valuable conversation to look at our finances in this way, not just from a money standpoint, but also from a mission standpoint. So when we are thinking about moving the cog of program costs, the program cost part of our business model, we often try to preserve all of our program services, everything we do. Sometimes we make incremental expense reductions that don't really move the needle. And we're really trying to match our internal expense accounting to grant budgets. And so we don't really see the full cost of the program. Rather, we just see the cost that the government will reimburse, for example. So if we want to move that cog a little bit more, we should really consider analyzing our true program costs, really taking a look at the bottom line of our programs, as well as maybe looking at our programs through a mission and money standpoint. We want to assess the portfolio of our programs and act on those findings. So maybe we find something that is low financial success, low mission support. Maybe that's something we need to talk about. We can also refine the cost of our programs to align with the value delivered. So maybe that's asking for more money for an increase in rate, for maybe finding a little bit more funding for something. Because when you understand the true cost of something, you can fully fund it. And then finally, we can review decisions about the use of our available subsidy funds. So if you have a program that loses money and you have a few programs that make money, you may have some surplus available to spend on sort of underwriting that program that loses money. But that is a big discussion to have in your organization. Because when we see a budget like this where one program is losing money and one program has a surplus, we have some decisions to make. Do we try to sort of move the needle on this program to make it so it's making money, or do we take some of this surplus that we have in our other programs to sort of support program A? And often this is what nonprofits do, right? We don't have 100% of our programs making money. That's just not something we do. But we often have a few programs or maybe a fundraising program that can help support those programs that don't run a surplus. Okay, the last piece we're going to talk about is capitalization, capital structure. So these are our financial resources, our cash, our investments, our fixed resources. These are capital. And so when we think about capital, we're thinking about assets, the things that we own. And we often think about these things in terms of like a time horizon. So if this is really talking about our balance sheet, the way that we earn revenue, the way that we spend revenue, our program expenses, those are really kind of income statement items. What we're talking about here in capital structure is really our balance sheet. So if you want to think about it, like the actual implications of some of this hypothetical stuff to the real, documents in your organization, it's income statement, it's balance sheet. But we often have cash, receivables, inventory. These things are often listed in our short-term assets, and they're a little bit more flexible in that they are cash or they could be turned into cash pretty easily. But we also often have long-term investments or fixed assets that are still have great value, but they are a little bit less flexible in that they're more difficult to turn into cash. So if you have investments that have a certain, time length on them, if you have CDs that are 60 months long or whatever, you don't have access to that cash right away. It's not liquid. If you own a building, you have a great asset, but you can't turn it into cash unless you sell it. So it's a little bit less flexible. The role of capital in our organizations is important because it helps us operate the enterprise. It helps us manage our cash flow cycles. If you have cash on hand, if you have maybe a little reserve fund set up, you can manage the times where your cash flow goes low internally. Otherwise, you might need some help, right, with a line of credit or something like that. It also helps us. The other things we need to think about when we have capital assets are, we need to provide for our permanent obligations. So if we have what's the word? I totally lost my word. It's not a foundation. It's what's the money that is permanently restricted? Oh my goodness. Endowment. Points to you. Thank you. I've only had one cup of coffee, everyone. Sometimes it's hard to think about all the financial words this early in the morning. So you might have an endowment, right? And you have to take care of that because you usually cannot spend the principal investment amount. So you have to take care of that. You have to make sure you're not spending it. If you have assets like a building or like a fleet of vehicles, you have to keep them in good working order. You have to invest in them. You might need a building reserve or a maintenance reserve. Having some fixed assets, though, can also protect your enterprise in the case of unusual external events and problems. So if you own a building, you may be more insulated to big changes in the rental market, for example. But it also costs money to maintain and upgrade those assets, as we know. And so the other thing to think about is, there are constant changes in our market and our community, whether we're talking about interest rates, whether we're talking about, interest rates on purchases. So if you're thinking about buying a building, the interest rates are higher than they've been in a long time. That's something to think about. If you're thinking about maybe turning some of your cash into an investment, also a great opportunity because rates are higher than they've been in a long time. So um, these are all things to think about as they play into the role of capital in our organizations. Generally speaking, all organizations need cash and working capital to maintain their operations, to do their work. Most organizations need some fixed assets to do their operations, whether that's computers, websites, office furniture. Most organizations also need to have some sort of operating or opportunity reserve available, so some cash on hand to help you get through times where there is, cash flow, maybe grants don't come through, or, if it's an opportunity reserve, for example, to help you build up some money to make that big program change or to try something new, right? Some organizations have or need buildings, depend on their line of work, but with buildings come, the need for reserves, as well as some organizations have endowments, and those have specialized requirements, right? We need to make sure that we're keeping that cash on hand if we have an endowment. So how do we change our capital structure? We want to, the things that we want to do are to, have balanced budgets, to quickly solve our cash flow programs, to preserve all of our assets, to satisfy creditors. Everyone wants an endowment. Not everyone should have an endowment. Because you need to have a big endowment for it to really earn money for you and to serve you well. But what are ways that we could think about this? Let's understand our balance sheets. Understand the mission value of our major assets. There are times when, like, owning a building or a fleet of vehicles or having a huge amount of cash on hand are really important to serving the organization. And there are some times where maybe those assets are no longer serving the organization. Prioritizing working capital is important, making sure that you have cash to do the work that you want to do. But also, if there's one thing in the capital structure that you can think about changing, is to develop a plan for reserves. I think that we've seen over the past 4 years, especially, that having some cash on hand, particularly as we navigate global crises like pandemics, is very helpful. There were like a month or two right at the outset of COVID, like the COVID shutdowns, where organizations didn't know where their money was going to come from for the foreseeable future. And the organizations that had a reserve fund, that had some cash on hand, could more calmly navigate that uncertainty. And so building up some reserves can be a really great asset and a really helpful tool for your organization. Okay, so we talked about all of these pieces of business models today: revenue, programs, capital, infrastructure. The thing to remember as you are digesting all this information over your second breakfast after this is to remember that all of these changes are interrelated. You can't really change your revenue mix without thinking about how it's going to affect your programs. You can't make huge infrastructure decisions or changes without thinking about how it's going to affect your revenue, because often changing our infrastructure is a costly ordeal. And certainly if you make big changes to your capital structure, like buying a building is a huge business model change because it affects all of these things. And so just know that you can't really make any change to any of these pieces of your business model kind of like in a silo. They all affect each other in some way or another. Oh, please tell me it's going to turn. Yes. So this is true. You know, the pieces of your business model are always moving. And so just kind of really understanding them, understanding how you can make the move slower or faster, to make them bigger or smaller is just really important in your organization. I know I'm a minute over. We have a few, well, first of all, I have a few minutes after this. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. I'll also just offer, since you're all nonprofit folks, that we have, in addition to our programming like the financial leadership cohort we mentioned, we also have some longer workshops each month. We also have free webinars every month. And so if you're looking to kind of like just like spend your lunch hour picking up some new skills or just kind of like adding to your library of nonprofit knowledge, if you sign up for our webinars, you get a free recording of them as well. So that's something to just keep in mind. But we have some coming up on having generative conversations with your boards. Love that topic. Managing cash flow. I think I might be leading that one. This is an old slide, guys. I'm sorry. January. I'm gonna send you our training calendar when I send you your follow-up resources. So all that to be said, does anyone have any follow-up questions about business models?
Yeah, one that came up for me, and folks, if you have to go, please do, but with the true program costs, like some funders are only program grant oriented, and
Yeah.
so like, do you have thoughts on like how to change that landscape and get more funders to understand that like we can't deliver this program unless you support our staff infrastructure to make it happen?
Absolutely. That's actually so like Propel is a 501c3 nonprofit, and so we do not lobby at the Capitol. However, we do lobby funders to understand that. We're often having conversations with folks that fund nonprofits about that very issue. And I think that's where it's important to maybe have both your program budget that the grantor wants, right? But also have the true program cost version of that budget available to have the conversation with the funder like, we appreciate your support and it actually costs this much to operate this program that you're funding. And so would you consider an increase or, a percentage increase on rate or reimbursement or an expansion of the grant? It's a good it's a good starting point for the conversation. And I think to always just, if we're all telling funders that message of like, I know you just want to fund this, but we can't just do this, right? We can't just serve lunch to people. Someone needs to make the lunch, someone needs to serve the lunch. There are people that need to buy the groceries. Like there's so much more that goes into the program than just like the black and white program costs that we sometimes have to put in our budget. So just keep talking about it.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Now, the other issue I face is the funder who, says, well, you're gonna get the same amount every year without any understanding that our costs of delivering the program have escalated in the last decade since you've been giving that same amount and your money is doing less. But, it's so hard to lobby them to give you more than just, it's just, they don't want to think about it. It's just, you get $5,000,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where just, if, I know there are some funders that just like, write the check every year, right? And there's not like that relationship necessarily in place. But when you do have a funder where, you sit down with them a few times a year or you provide them with some regularly, maybe more narrative reporting, I think taking those opportunities to just tell that story, even if it's broader, right? Like as an organization, we were only able to serve this many people this year. Last year we served 10,000 more people, but because of inflation and this and that and the other thing, we simply weren't able to deliver as much programming, even though our budget's the same. I mean, I think at like a human level, we all understand that, right? Like we've all bought groceries in the last year. I have a 1-year-old, so he just started drinking regular milk, and holy cow, the cost of a gallon of whole milk, guys, it is expensive. Organic milk, it's like $9 a gallon. That is wild. Like, we understand the financial impacts of, and like we all do as humans, of the last few years. And so I think bringing that into the discussion of our business is, it's not a bad thing, you know? Not a bad thing to let people know that their investment isn't going as far as it used to go. Sorry for my milk rant, but geez, that's it.
I feel your pain.
I have an 11-month-old, Sarah, so I'm like 1 month away from that.
Oh my
For
gosh.
the morning.
Godspeed.
I know.
Sometimes when I stop at Quick Trip, I just get the normal milk, and sometimes when I'm feeling really generous, I buy the organic milk. But you know,
Yep.
if it's not a pay week, it's really hard to spend the $9.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'll share some follow-up resources that I mentioned throughout the presentation. But always feel free to reach out to me or anyone at Propel if you have other contacts there. We'd love to chat nonprofit related stuff. So hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah, you too. Bye.